The dust cloud rose like a prayer against the Arizona sky, announcing the arrival of something Redemption Creek had never wanted. Sister Mary Catherine clutched her worn leather satchel tighter as the stagecoach lurched to a stop, its wheels grinding against the red earth that seemed to bleed beneath the relentless sun. Through the small window, she could see them, faces pressed against storefront windows, eyes narrowing with suspicion and something darker, fear perhaps, or hatred dressed in Sunday clothes. She had prayed for this moment during the 3-day journey from Santa Fe, her rosary beads warm between calloused fingers. But now, standing on the threshold of her new mission, Sister Mary Catherine felt the weight of every whispered warning she'd received. "They don't take kindly to papists in Redemption Creek," the territorial governor had said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "But the church insists, and there are souls there who need saving." What he hadn't said, but what hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, was that those souls belonged to the forgotten. The Chinese railroad workers, the Mexican families, the widows and orphans that polite Protestant society had pushed to its fringes. The stagecoach driver, a weathered man named Jake, who'd grown quieter with each mile toward their destination, now avoided her eyes entirely. "This is far as I go, sister," he muttered, not bothering to help her down. "You sure about this? Town ain't exactly welcoming to your kind." His words carried the sting of truth. She'd seen it in Santa Fe, in Tucson, in every settlement where the cross she wore marked her as different, dangerous, foreign. But Sister Mary Catherine had not traveled 800 miles to retreat at the first sign of hostility. Her worn shoes, already thin from years of service in Boston's immigrant quarters, touched the dusty street with purpose. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she could feel sweat beginning to form beneath her heavy habit. But she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. Across the street, Reverend Samuel Morrison emerged from what was clearly the town's Protestant church, his black coat pristine despite the heat, his pale eyes fixed on her with undisguised contempt. "Well, well," he called out, his voice carrying across the street with practiced authority, "the wolf arrives in sheep's clothing." A small crowd began to gather, drawn by his words like moths to a flame. "I hope you're just passing through, sister. This is a God-fearing town, and we have our own shepherds." The words hit her like physical blows, but Sister Mary Catherine had endured worse. In Boston, she'd faced angry mobs when cholera struck the Irish tenements. She'd been spat upon, threatened, called a witch, and worse. But here, in this small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, the hostility felt more personal, more intimate in its cruelty. "I'm here to serve God and His people," she replied, her Irish accent thick with emotion despite her efforts to control it. "All His people." The emphasis on "all" was not lost on the gathering crowd, and she could see faces hardening, whispers beginning to spread like wildfire. As the stagecoach pulled away in a cloud of dust, leaving her standing alone with her single satchel and unwavering faith, Sister Mary Catherine noticed a woman watching from the shadows of a nearby alley. Unlike the others, this woman's face held no malice, only a deep, aching sadness that seemed to mirror something in her own soul. The woman's dress was black, marking her as a widow, and her hands clutched a shawl despite the oppressive heat. For a moment their eyes met across the hostile space, two outcasts recognizing something in each other. Then the woman melted back into the shadows, leaving Sister Mary Catherine to face the gathering storm alone. But she was not truly alone. She had her faith, her determination, and somewhere in this harsh land, she would find the souls she'd been sent to serve, even if it meant walking through fire to reach them. 3 days had passed since Sister Mary Catherine's arrival, and already the town had made its position clear. The small adobe building she'd rented at the edge of town, the only property owner willing to take her money, was a drunk who needed cash more than he feared social ostracism, had been vandalized twice. This morning, she'd awakened to find crude words painted across the door in what looked suspiciously like pig's blood. The smell still lingered in the desert air, mixing with the scent of sage and something else. something rotten. She knelt on the hard-packed earth floor of her makeshift chapel, trying to scrub away the stains with water she'd carried from the well 3 streets over. The bucket was heavy, the walk longer each time, because fewer people would acknowledge her presence, let alone offer help. Her knees ached, her back protested, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the gnawing doubt that had begun to eat at her resolve. Had she misunderstood God's calling? Was her presence here truly serving His will, or was it her own pride driving her forward? "Forgive me, Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the empty room. "Show me the way. Show me who needs your love in this place." The words felt hollow, lost in the vastness of her uncertainty. Back in Boston, her path had seemed clear. Tend to the sick, feed the hungry, comfort the dying. Here it seemed her very existence caused more suffering than relief. A soft knock at the door interrupted her prayer. Sister Mary Catherine rose carefully, her habit rustling in the silence. Through the small window she could see a slight figure, a boy, maybe 16, with distinctly Asian features and clothes that marked him as one of the Chinese railroad workers. His eyes darted nervously left and right before he knocked again, more urgently this time. She opened the door to find Tommy Chen, though she didn't know his name yet. His English was broken but earnest, as he gestured frantically toward the railroad camps. "Please, sister lady, come quick. My father, he very sick. Doctor won't come. Says we no pay enough." Tears streamed down his dust-covered cheeks, carving clean tracks through the grime. "He dying. Please." Without hesitation, Sister Mary Catherine grabbed her small medical kit, basic supplies she'd learned to use during her years in the tenements. The boy led her through back alleys and forgotten paths, avoiding the main streets where their passage might be observed. The Chinese camp sat isolated beyond the town proper, a collection of ramshackle tents and lean-tos that housed the men who'd built the railroad that brought prosperity to Redemption Creek. Yet their contribution was forgotten, their presence barely tolerated. The smell hit her first, unwashed bodies, opium smoke, and underneath it all, the sweet, sick odor of fever and approaching death. Tommy's father lay on a straw mattress, his breathing shallow and labored. Sister Mary Catherine had seen cholera before, recognized its cruel progression. In Boston, she'd held dying children in her arms, whispered final prayers in languages she barely understood. But here, tending to this forgotten man in his forgotten corner of the world, she felt something shift inside her chest. "What his name?" she asked Tommy, kneeling beside the dying man. "Chen Wei," the boy whispered, "means great in Chinese, but nobody here think he great. Just coolie, just nothing." Sister Mary Catherine took the man's burning hand in hers, feeling the calluses earned through years of backbreaking labor. "Chen Wei," she said carefully, and watched as the man's eyes flickered open at the sound of his name spoken with respect. She began to pray, not the formal Latin of her training, but words that came from somewhere deeper, more honest. Words about dignity and love, and the sacred worth of every human soul. As the night wore on, she stayed with Chen Wei and his son, offering water, cooling cloths, and most importantly, presence. She was still there when he drew his last breath just before dawn, his hand still clasped in hers. Tommy wept quietly, and Sister Mary Catherine found herself crying too, not just for this good man's death, but for a world that had decided his life had no value. When she finally emerged from the camp, the sun was rising over Redemption Creek, painting the mountains gold and red. In the distance, she could see the town stirring to life, unaware and uncaring that Chen Wei had died in the night. But Sister Mary Catherine carried his memory like a flame in her chest, and for the first time since arriving, she knew with absolute certainty why she had been called to this place. The funeral service for Chen Wei took place in the shadow of the railway depot, attended only by his fellow workers and one Irish nun whose presence had begun to stir the pot of Redemption Creek's carefully maintained order. Sister Mary Catherine spoke what few Chinese words Tommy had taught her, watched as the men lowered their friend into desert ground that would never know his true name or the dreams he'd carried across an ocean. As dirt fell on the simple pine coffin, she noticed eyes watching from the town proper. Not mourners, but observers calculating the threat her compassion represented. Word traveled fast in a small town. By Sunday morning, Reverend Morrison's sermon had taken on a decidedly pointed tone. Sister Mary Catherine could hear his voice carrying across the desert air as she knelt in her own makeshift chapel, his words sharp as broken glass. "Beware false prophets," he thundered, though he never mentioned her by name. "Those who would corrupt our children with foreign superstitions, who cavort with heathens and bring plague upon decent folk." She had expected persecution, but the speed and viciousness of the town's response still took her breath away. Within hours of the funeral, her small supply of food had been poisoned. Someone had scattered rat poison over her meager stores of beans and flour. The well she'd been drawing from was suddenly declared private property. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, posted a sign that read, "We reserve the right to refuse service," and made sure Sister Mary Catherine saw her pointing at it through the window. But it was the children's reactions that cut deepest. Tommy Chen had begun visiting her chapel in the evenings, bringing other Chinese workers who wanted to learn English or simply sit in a space where they weren't viewed as vermin. She'd also attracted a small Mexican family, Maria Santos and her 3 young daughters, who had been living in a tent behind the blacksmith shop since her husband died in a mining accident. These forgotten souls had found something in Sister Mary Catherine's presence that the town's established churches hadn't offered: unconditional acceptance. The problem was that their children played together in the town where racial lines were drawn with surgical precision. Seeing Chinese, Mexican and Irish children sharing the same space, learning the same prayers, was viewed as nothing short of revolutionary sedition. Parents began pulling their own children indoors when they spotted Sister Mary Catherine walking past, as if her very presence might infect them with some terrible disease called tolerance. Doc Harrison was the first to break ranks, though not in the way she'd hoped. She encountered him outside the barber shop on a scorching Tuesday afternoon, his medical bag in hand, sweat beading on his forehead despite the shade. "Sister," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I need to speak plainly with you." His eyes darted around, checking for eavesdroppers. "You're stirring up trouble you can't handle. These people, they've got their ways, their order. You're upsetting a balance that keeps this town from tearing itself apart." "Balance?" Sister Mary Catherine's Irish temper flared before she could contain it. "Is that what you call letting good people die because they don't have the right color skin or worship at the right altar?" She gestured toward the Chinese camp, barely visible in the distance. "Chen Wei was a better Christian than most of the men who sit in your Sunday pews, and he never set foot in a church." Doc Harrison's face reddened, but whether from anger or shame, she couldn't tell. "That may be true, sister, but truth and survival ain't always the same thing. You keep pushing, and someone's going to push back harder than you're prepared for." He tipped his hat, a gesture that somehow felt more like a warning than courtesy, and walked away. That evening, as she prepared for her simple supper of hardtack and water, her food supplies now came from sympathetic workers who smuggled her provisions under cover of darkness. Sister Mary Catherine found herself thinking about Doc Harrison's words. She knelt before the crude wooden cross she'd fashioned from railroad ties, her knees finding the worn spots on the hard floor. "Lord," she whispered, "am I serving you or my own stubborn pride?" The silence that answered felt heavier than the desert air, pressing down on her shoulders like the weight of every soul she'd failed to save. The fire started in the bakery just after midnight on a Thursday, when the desert wind whipped through Redemption Creek like the breath of some ancient, angry god. Sister Mary Catherine awoke to the smell of smoke and the sound of men shouting. Their voices carried on the same wind that fanned the flames threatening to consume half the town. She didn't hesitate. Grabbing her shawl and rushing into the street, she joined the bucket brigade that had formed, despite the late hour and mutual animosities that usually kept neighbors apart. The fire had already claimed Henderson's general store and was licking hungrily at the wooden frame of the boarding house next door. In the orange glow, she could see familiar faces. Reverend Morrison organizing the men, Doc Harrison shouting orders, even some of the Chinese workers running with buckets despite being unwelcome in town during daylight hours. Crisis had a way of stripping away pretense, revealing the raw humanity underneath social convention. It was young Sally Morrison, the Reverend's 8-year-old daughter, who changed everything. In the chaos and smoke, she had wandered too close to the flames, her nightgown catching sparks, her small form disappearing behind a wall of smoke and falling timber. Sister Mary Catherine saw her first, a flash of white cotton amid the red and orange destruction, and didn't think, only moved. The heat hit her like a physical blow as she pushed through the smoke-choked doorway of the collapsing boarding house. Her habit, heavy wool meant for Boston winters, seemed to catch every ember, every spark. She could hear people shouting behind her, voices calling her back, but Sally Morrison's terrified cries cut through everything else. The child was trapped behind a fallen beam, too scared to move, too small to climb over the obstacle that blocked her escape. Sister Mary Catherine's hands burned as she lifted the smoldering timber, her strength fueled by something beyond mere adrenaline. She scooped up the trembling girl, pressing the child's face against her shoulder to shield her from the smoke and heat. The journey back through the burning building felt like walking through the gates of hell itself, her lungs searing with each breath, her vision blurring from smoke and pain. When she stumbled out of the building with Sally in her arms, the entire town seemed to pause. The bucket brigade stopped mid-motion, water dripping forgotten from suspended buckets. Reverend Morrison stood frozen, his face pale as ash in the firelight, his arms reaching for his daughter. Behind him, his wife Sarah wept openly, her hands clasped in prayer. Sister Mary Catherine placed Sally gently in her father's arms, swaying slightly from smoke inhalation and exhaustion. The child was frightened but unharmed, her nightgown singed but her skin intact. For a moment, the only sounds were the crackling of flames and Sally's quiet sobs against her father's chest. "Thank you," Reverend Morrison whispered, his voice cracking with emotion he usually kept hidden behind pulpit authority. "Thank you, sister." The words seemed to cost him something, an acknowledgement that challenged everything he'd preached about the dangers she represented. But as the sun rose over the smoldering ruins of what had been Redemption Creek's main street, Sister Mary Catherine could already see the walls rebuilding themselves in people's eyes. Gratitude was a fleeting emotion, and fear ran deeper than appreciation. She had saved the Reverend's daughter, but she was still the Catholic outsider who threatened their carefully constructed world. The fire had revealed something about the town's character, but it had also shown them something about hers. And that, she suspected, might prove more dangerous than any flames. The gratitude lasted exactly 3 days. By Sunday morning, Reverend Morrison had found his voice again, and with it a new justification for the persecution that Sister Mary Catherine had briefly hoped might end. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he proclaimed from his rebuilt pulpit, his daughter Sally sitting in the front pew, her small hands folded in perfect imitation of piety. "He sometimes uses even the most unlikely vessels to test our faith and resolve." The message was clear. Her heroism had been God's work, not her own, and it certainly didn't change her fundamental nature as a threat to their community. If anything, it made her more dangerous. A wolf who had proven capable of wearing sheep's clothing so convincingly that even a child had been fooled. The town meeting was called for Thursday evening, ostensibly to discuss rebuilding efforts after the fire, but Sister Mary Catherine knew better. She had seen the whispered conversations, the meaningful glances, the way people stopped talking when she passed. Margaret Walsh, the widow she'd glimpsed that first day, had warned her through Tommy Chen, a message passed in shadows like contraband. "They mean to make you leave," the boy had whispered. "The widow lady, she says they got papers, legal papers, town council vote." Sister Mary Catherine spent that Thursday in prayer, kneeling before her makeshift altar until her knees bled through her habit. She prayed for wisdom, for strength, for some sign of what God truly wanted from her in this hostile place. But heaven remained stubbornly silent, offering no burning bushes or angelic visitations, just the endless whisper of desert wind through the gaps in her adobe walls. When evening came, she walked to the meeting by choice rather than wait to be dragged. The schoolhouse was packed. Faces turned toward her with expressions ranging from righteous indignation to barely concealed hatred. Reverend Morrison stood at the front like a prosecutor, preparing to deliver his closing argument. Behind him, she could see the official papers, her eviction notice signed by the territorial judge and witnessed by every member of the town council. "Sister Mary Catherine O'Brien," Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of official authority, "you have been found to be a corrupting influence on the moral fabric of our community. The territorial government has granted our petition for your removal." He held up the papers like a trophy. "You have until sunrise tomorrow to gather your belongings and leave Redemption Creek permanently." A cheer went up from the crowd, a sound like wolves howling at a full moon. But not everyone was cheering. She could see Tommy Chen near the back door, tears streaming down his young face. Maria Santos clutched her daughters close, her eyes wide with fear about what would happen to them without the nuns' protection. And there, in the shadows by the window, stood Margaret Walsh, her face a mask of pain that Sister Mary Catherine recognized as a mirror of her own. The papers were legal, the decision final, the community united in their desire to see her gone. She had fought the good fight and lost, her mission ending not in martyrdom, but in simple, bureaucratic defeat. They took her shoes at dawn. Not officially. That wasn't written in the legal papers, but as a final cruelty, a last humiliation before her exile. 3 men from the town council arrived as the sun painted the desert sky pink and gold, their faces hard as the stones they carried. "Walk out the way you came in," Mayor Bradford said, his voice flat with finality. "But leave everything that belongs to this town." Her shoes, they claimed, had been purchased at Henderson's store. Even though the store had burned, even though Henderson himself wasn't there to confirm or deny, they declared her worn leather boots property of Redemption Creek. Sister Mary Catherine stood in her bare feet on the threshold of her adobe chapel, feeling the cold morning earth seep through her stockings, knowing that by noon the sun would turn the ground into burning coals. The walk through town began in silence, her small satchel clutched against her chest, her bare feet already tender against the rough stones and thorns. Behind her trailed the procession. Most of the town had come to witness her departure, to see their collective will made manifest. Children pointed and whispered. Women clutched their shawls tighter, as if her very presence might contaminate them one last time. Each step sent sharp pain through her feet, but Sister Mary Catherine held her head high, her lips moving in silent prayer. This was her Calvary, she told herself. This was what Christ meant when he spoke of taking up the cross. Blood began to seep through her stockings, leaving small red stains on the dusty street, marking her passage like a wounded animal. It was at the town's edge, where the desert began in earnest and hope ended, that the miracle happened. Margaret Walsh stepped out of the crowd, her black dress stark against the morning light, her weathered hands shaking as she bent down and removed her own shoes. Simple brown leather, worn but sturdy, the shoes of a woman who had walked her own path of sorrow. "Take them," Margaret said, her voice breaking the terrible silence. She knelt in the dust before Sister Mary Catherine, placing the shoes gently at her feet like an offering at an altar. "Take them, sister. No one should walk barefoot through hell." The crowd gasped, a sound like wind through wheat. Reverend Morrison stepped forward, his face purpling with rage. "Margaret Walsh, what do you think you're doing?" Margaret rose slowly, her stockinged feet now touching the same cruel ground, her eyes meeting his without fear. "What should have been done long ago," she said, showing Christian mercy. And in that moment, As Sister Mary Catherine slipped her bleeding feet into the widow's shoes, something shifted in Redemption Creek. Not everything, not the hearts of all, but enough. Enough to plant a seed in the desert. Enough to prove that love could still grow in the hardest ground.